the biggest damage that the Ukrainians are causing with the long-range strikes right now is political. It is massively, visibly undermining Putin's narrative to his subjects. For the Ukrainians, denying Russia air superiority over Ukraine is the condition that is required for any hope of victory, and so far they've achieved it. My name's Justin Bronk. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Air Power at the defence think tank RUSI in the UK. So Ukraine increasingly has an advantage at the moment with its long-range strike campaign, and particularly its mid-range strike campaign, which is quite new as a major tactic for them. Primarily because it's been going on long enough that the Russians are starting to run short of ammunition for quite a lot of air defense systems. So more of the hundreds and hundreds of UAVs each week are getting through. It's still only a handful generally, but because what they're targeting, primarily oil and gas infrastructure, is extremely flammable and is very extensive, i.e. each site is huge, so the munitions don't have to be that accurate. Even if there's a bit of degradation from electronic warfare defenses nearby, the accuracy is still probably good enough to hit something that's flammable. And then once you set it on fire, fires and explosions will cause secondary damage. So they're attacking a target set that is well suited for what they can get through on a regular basis. The fact that they're bringing in more and more long-ranged propeller-powered missiles, which is what these one-way attack UAVs are, means that Russia is having to spread the air defenses it has over an ever wider area. Because, for example, the area of Russia in terms of actual geographic space that you could attack things in, that is, in terms of the difference between a system that has 1,000-kilometer range versus a 2,000-kilometer range, is not double. It's more than that, because it's not just a linear range. You can go anywhere in a much, much, much bigger kind of cone. So the Russians are having to try and defend an increasingly large area against an increasingly reliable series of waves of one-way attack drones, and increasingly a small number of cruise missiles as well from the Ukrainian side, the FP5 Flamingos and possibly something else that hit the Voronezh recently, a factory. So the Russian system is showing strain, which means that the Ukrainians are certainly having a good effect in terms of forcing the Russians to allocate resources away from the front lines, which means that the Ukrainians have more freedom than they otherwise would have to interdict Russian supply lines near the front lines, which is helping their position on the front itself. So the mid-strike campaign going after trucks, resupply convoys, that kind of stuff, particularly around Crimea, but around most bits of the front, is also having a significant effect on the frontline areas. But that's partly enabled by the dispersion of Russian air defense capacity away from the frontline areas from the long-range strike campaign. And the final element is, it's worth remembering, this is not causing critical physical damage to Russia. It's expensive for them. It's certainly something that they hate to see. But the biggest damage that the Ukrainians are causing with the long-range strikes right now is political. It is massively, visibly undermining Putin's narrative to his subjects, which has always been, you let me rule as a dictator, you don't protest, and in return, I give you stability. Things will continue. The chaos of the post-Soviet period in the 90s will not return. And anything I do to my enemies, both internal or domestic, won't affect you in Russia. That is being completely undermined by the fuel shortages, the regular, very visible, massive fires at refineries around places like St. Petersburg, Moscow, Omsk. And so in that sense, the Ukrainian long-range strike campaign is having a far greater effect than even the significant economic damage would suggest. If you are a force that relies on your opponent not having air superiority, then mutual denial is enough. So for the Russians, most of their firepower is on the ground. The fact that they can't is because the Ukrainians have maintained a very good, effective use of ground-based air defenses primarily. And these days, they also have some very capable people flying F-16 in some numbers. It was great to see a Sukhoi 35 shot down by an F-16 last week. A great result from the Ukrainians. Long may it continue. It is also worth noting, though, that it was a Su-35 and came down fairly close to the border. So it doesn't necessarily represent a guideline for what could be done with F-16 and AMRAAM against the Su-34s dropping glide bombs, which are the real problem, because those are dropping from much further back. And so while it's great to see, I don't think it reduces the need for a different solution to start addressing that Su-34 glide bomb threat, which remains one of Ukraine's key military problems. So for the Ukrainians, denying Russia air superiority over Ukraine is the victory condition, or is the condition that is required for any hope of victory. And so far they've achieved it. The attack helicopters are the bit of the traditional military aviation ecosystem that is most directly threatened by the very rapid and continued growth in the capability of different types of UAVs, because unlike traditional fighter aircraft, which typically operate at well above 15,000 feet and at very high speeds where just getting to them with UAVs isn't really possible, for the helicopters, they are used to operating at 50 feet. They hover for parts of their flight, and they don't tend to fly nearly as fast. Most attack helicopters tend to cruise at about 180 knots or slightly under. And so fast battlefield UAVs and loitering munitions can get to them, as has been demonstrated by the footage from the past week with the Mi-28 attack helicopter. It is noticeable that Mi-28 clearly didn't know the UAV was there and could have accelerated to a speed that the UAV wouldn't have been able to catch. You could see it's kind of struggling to keep up. And the UAV probably didn't go out to hunt that helicopter, in the sense that it takes too long typically for a UAV like that to get from the operator to where the helicopter is at the sort of standoff distances they tend to operate. So the UAV was already probably there looking for other targets, and then saw the helicopter through the first person view camera and engaged it. The problem is that doesn't really help from a helicopter pilot point of view if there are so many UAVs around, and if they're increasingly automated or have automation built into them. It's a bit like going through a sort of airborne minefield that can seek you out if you go too close. I think basically attack aviation still has a role insofar as it's still the most effective way to concentrate highly efficient anti-tank firepower, as opposed to just anti-vehicle or infantry, which UAVs can do at scale very efficiently. Anti-tank is still quite hard. Typically, small FPV type UAVs, you need 10, 15, 20 often impacts to disable a tank reliably, especially if it's being operated well as part of a formation. But of course, that's the footage you then see. So the UAVs look more efficient than they are. And also, helicopters are quite good at intercepting one-way attack UAVs. So Russian helicopter gunships intercept a lot of Ukrainian one-way attack UAVs. So is the attack helicopter dead? No, but it is something that has to be used a lot more carefully. Attrition rates near the front line can be expected to be a lot higher than they used to be if they're used in traditional ways. And I think over time, they are likely to get more and more into a territory where, yes, they can be useful, but they might not be worth the cost anymore because they are very expensive. I'd say air defense, and particularly missile defense, is potentially infinite resource drain if you try to protect everything everywhere all the time. You can't. Ukraine is trying to manage the resource drain and the finite supply, most notably the finite supply. They actually have quite a bit of money available now because of the recent loans through the EU to fund their defense efforts. The problem is not so much not being able to buy enough interceptor missiles for things like Patriot, it's that they just can't get them because there aren't enough globally. And so the way that the Ukrainians have tried to manage this is to be as efficient as they possibly can. So what they've tried to do is build have done very successfully, I should say, is built a belt of very cheap, short-range air defense systems all around the sort of areas near the border with Russia or near the front lines, so that there are a couple of tens of kilometers where any incoming wave of drones, for example, Geran 2, 3, Gebera decoy drones, and cruise missiles, like the CR-101 fired by Russian bombers, or Calabirs fired from ships. They have to get through that kind of belt of machine guns with optical kind of aiming systems that have some machine learning algorithms to help them be more accurate. Traditional, just like trucks with guys in the back with machine guns, and lots of increasingly large numbers of drone interceptors, so little propeller-powered missiles that are 3D printed with relatively cheap components that can try and go up, and a little explosive to try and go up and like collide with the adversary, with the Russian one-way attack drones. Those systems are increasingly destroying kind of 70 to 80% of the incoming Russian Geran 2 and 3 attack drones, and particularly the Geran 2, the propeller-powered ones, and the Geberas, the decoy drones. So that has massively reduced the number of really expensive missiles, either from F-16s or from ground-based systems like NASAMS, that they're having to use to defend key targets from those incoming cheapish drones. And it also means that more capacity is available, therefore, from those higher end systems like F-16 with AIM-9 Sidewinder or AMRAAM, or NASAMS with AMRAAM, or IRIS-T, SLS or SLMs, a ground-based German-made surface-to-air missile system. Those can be concentrated on cruise missiles, which are much, much harder for short-range systems to shoot down. They're also much more dangerous because they have huge warheads and they're more accurate and they're faster. So that's much more efficient. And then the whole thing is Ukraine is trying to conserve what Patriot interceptors it does have or is able to get resupplied sometimes for just the ballistic missiles that nothing else can intercept. But ultimately, that still involves choices of where you put what scarce ability you have as the Ukrainians to defend against ballistic missiles. Where do you put it? Because you can't defend the whole country. There aren't enough Patriot batteries, let alone Patriot missiles for those batteries. It's also notable that Ukraine, despite relying more and more heavily on drones of all kinds, battlefield and long-range strike, is desperately trying to acquire modern fighter aircraft in large numbers. It's also notable that China, which has the biggest, most capable drone industry on Earth by miles, so almost all Russian and most Ukrainian drones use Chinese components because that's where the majority of them are made. China is not focusing on mostly uncrewed systems. They are building hundreds of extremely high-end crewed fighter aircraft and attack aircraft per year. They're building 4 or 5 AWACS a year, so crewed, manned, radar surveillance aircraft. They're building tens of destroyers at sea, destroyers and cruisers, so major surface combatant ships at sea, and thousands upon thousands of high-end missiles. So one probably needs to ask, if you think the era of crewed fighter aircraft are over, why are our adversaries still producing hundreds a year and investing in next generation types? Most of the people who hope the era of high-end fighter aircraft, for example, are over are people looking at budgets that don't add up for what their capability requirements are, i.e. mostly Western governments, and particularly European, UK governments, looking at how to solve capability requirements that we haven't been able to or willing to allocate the funding for to do traditionally. Problem is our opponents are doing both. The Russians are still building quite a lot of fighter aircraft and lots of long-range big missiles per year, but they're also building thousands and thousands of one-way attack drones and millions of battlefield drones. So we need to do both. And it's worth remembering also that in Ukraine, the reason UAVs are so dominant on the front lines is because maneuver warfare is no longer really possible for both sides. But that's because both sides who had formations, both the Russians and the Ukrainians had formations at divisional scale or brigade scale at least, that could maneuver with tanks, with artillery, with supporting infantry to cover the advancing tanks for anti-tank teams, with artillery barrages to keep them in place, air defense to stop them being attacked by helicopters, electronic warfare to protect the force in general. Those formations were destroyed largely in the first year of the war through massive overuse because they were used all over the front in a very, very intensive way. And because the fighting has been so intense for so long, that expertise has not been rebuilt by either side. And the second reason is because there are millions of mines in front of all the front lines which have been laid. And to get through a minefield with any sort of large vehicle force, you need to clear lanes, which is what the Ukrainians tried in their summer offensive in 2023. And it tends to then, because you're going slowly to clear lanes behind mine clearance vehicles, the enemy tries to just knock out those few mine clearance vehicles, then you're stuck in the minefield and you get plastered with artillery. And then the drones come in and mop up what's left. So in the absence of being able to field lots of artillery, defensive minefields that you can lay quickly, with decent anti-tank guided missile capabilities and tanks to stop an adversary from just punching through rapidly with a big armored force. If you can't stop them doing that with those traditional systems, lots of small UAVs won't necessarily help you because they're not concentrated enough. They can't bring a concentrated enough amount of firepower to disperse a concentrated force quickly before it overruns you. So yeah, you need both. My theory is that when it comes to buying fighter aircraft or developing them, they're a bit like sports cars. People generally don't buy the cheapest sports car that will do the job. People tend to buy the most expensive sports car that they convince themselves they can afford, rightly or wrongly. And with fighter aircraft, I think it's a bit the same. Most countries tend to buy the most expensive, or rather highest end fighter aircraft that they convince themselves they can afford, whether they need all the capabilities it brings or not. For example, Switzerland has bought the F-35. There is no operational scenario I can think of that justifies Switzerland operating the F-35s. F-35 is phenomenally capable at going into defended airspace where there's lots of ground-based air defense threats like S-400s and a serious air threat as well. So it's stealthy, it has fantastic situational awareness, it has excellent electronic warfare capabilities. But you pay a lot for that in terms of complexity, security standards, because there's a lot of very high-end technology that's very highly classified. So it costs a lot to get all your maintenance people cleared to the level that they need to be to access it and to learn about how it all works so they can maintain it. The pilots need quite a bit of training. It's expensive to fly. If you are, let's say, Finland, and you exist right on the border, or Poland, and you exist right on the border of Russia, and you operate under those threat systems all the time, then of course it's worth that. Then that's probably the ideal jet for you in terms of what's available. But if you're, let's say, a relatively small, traditionally neutral country whose main requirement is internal air defense, and mostly it's intercepting unresponsive or hijacked airliners or general aviation people pootling around who've made a mistake and gone into the wrong area, you should probably go for something like a Gripen, which is much, much more efficient to operate. You can fly it a lot more. Your pilots can be more capable with the given amount of money because they fly more often, they practice. How do they make those choices? It depends on the country, but a mix of politics and budgetary realities.